Hello, everyone, and welcome to the for Policy Not Found. And we have a wonderful guest, as we usually do today. I have Dr. Elizabeth Dubois and Renee. It's here too. Why don't you get started?
Thanks, Elizabeth. We really appreciate you being here with us today. You and I met on a bus in Montreal last year, believe it was, at a conference talking about a lot of the challenges in information ecosystems that we're trying to navigate, figuring out how to navigate and how to regulate as a country right now. I'd love to hear a little bit just about who you are and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and to have this important conversation. I am a professor at the University of Ottawa, and I ended up here mostly because I was a page in my first year of undergrad, and that only happened because I was looking for a way to pay for school. So I ended up getting this job as a page in the House of Commons, which means I passed notes and delivered water to MPs. And just like fell in love with politics, and then got a job with a member of parliament right after. And I was trying to figure out what I could do in her office. And I was a young person and Twitter was new. And so I became her social media person. And over the course of my 4 years of undergrad, kind of went back and forth between academia, studying political communication, and working on the Hill and then in election campaigns in a really applied setting, and developed this little specialty in the way new tech is used for politics.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that context. And you have a podcast yourself. I'd love to hear a little bit. I know that Norman, you've got some great questions around that. Do you want to sort of maybe just dive into?
Yeah, and as I was doing my research on you and your work, I actually used Notebook LM to create infographics and slides about you and your work. And the way that the Notebook LM actually call you, because it gives titles based on what it knows. It says you're a full stack political scientist. I don't know if you ever heard that label on you, but it says Dr. Elizabeth Dubois is merging academic theory and political practice for the digital democracy. And yeah, there's some nice graphics actually. But yeah, I just wanted to hone in and like we're talking about before hitting record that you have this two big lenses and you have a podcast and we're saying like the Wonk and the War Room. What has been your experience seeing the world from those two lenses given your background? You had some, as we just said, political communications, being in parliament, involved with parliament,
Yeah.
your work. And I was like, how is that? How has that been being on those two realities? And you have a podcast that explores that as well, right?
Yeah, yeah. So the podcast is called Wonks in War Rooms. And the idea is I'm the wonk, the theoretical kind of like deep in the weeds of how things should happen, how we can describe what's going on. And then there's the war room, who's usually my guest on the podcast, who comes from some sort of applied setting. So it's often politicians or journalists or folks who work in civil society, the strategists, those kinds of people. I came to the idea of having this Wonks and War Rooms podcast really because I played that dual role, as I mentioned, like all through undergrad. I was half in academia, half in the applied setting in parliament. And I really, really benefited from having kind of a foot in each world. And so the podcast is really meant to bring those things together, because academic understandings of what's happening can be really, really helpful for doing deep dives and really understanding the nuances of the opportunities and challenges news technology put forward. But it's the applied view of it that really helps us understand, okay, but what's actually likely to happen right now? What's going on in this moment? What are the pain points right now? And how do we deal with those? And so I really, really love being able to be a bit of a bridge between those kinds of
Mm.
worlds.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's feels like such a big gap, especially. I think that there's a siloing of I think a lot of those voices at a moment in time when we really need those voices to be coming together and being a lot more fluid and trying to understand from a systems level. So appreciate that you bring that lens and then you try to act as a bit of a stitching together a bit of a connective tissue of these different communities. So that's fantastic to hear about that. I'd love, you've been working on researching influencers as a big part of your work. And I'd love to kind of just get a bit of a sense for how you like what was it about influencers that compelled you to try to understand what was going on. And you looked very specifically at the political applications, and of course that has context for elections. We've just gone through a federal election quite recently. So what compelled you to get into that, and what are you seeing now, and what are you not seeing? So maybe we can break those down, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there. And as you mentioned, this is a main area of my research right now. I'm really excited about it. So I could talk for a long time, but let's try and dig in. So let's start off with like what influencers even are. So I am really interested in these online personalities that gain some level of fame, notoriety, following. They sometimes are really large scale, have huge levels of following, might be similar to celebrities. But then there's also some influencers that are active on a particular social media platform, have a really specific niche audience, niche community that they've connected to, relatively low follower count, but still pretty meaningful to the community that they have built. And it's that huge range of large and small influencers that I'm really interested in. A lot of them are very, very active on social media, but I would say it also goes beyond social media. It's not just the Instagrammers and the TikTokers. It's also the people who have Patreon accounts and Discord and newsletters and podcasts. And so there's a really wide variety of ways that these online personalities are creating content that can have really meaningful impact on how we shape our political views, how we get informed about what's happening in an election or during a political crisis or scandal, and can set agendas and frame narratives for us.
Yeah, following on that, because I did went to the report that you participate in the political uses of AI in Canada, just thinking of AI usually as a double-edged sword. Many times, but just specifically on the influencer part, as I mentioned you before going on the podcast, I'm very interested to follow up on helping audience or everybody understand like what does it mean for for the word influencer or for the existence of an influencer when we have tools like Sora 2, which allows people to create very realistic videos, and then etc. allows you to create very realistic videos. And I've encountered myself actually the last couple of months noticing more and more videos, and I use Instagram and I like scroll down to Reels sometimes, and just noticing more and more fake videos generated with AI. And in today's world, we can replicate an influencer, right? So I think I was using the example of Morgan Freeman. It's like a trusted voice. You would listen to him describe episodes of nature and nature. Like, anyways, he's been the voiceover for a lot of videos, and you might say that he's a very recognizable, trusted voice. But you can totally create a video of Morgan Freeman saying just about anything. So what have you been seeing in terms of the work you've done on understanding and explaining what an influencer is now in the world of AI, when we have all this easiness for people to be able to replicate and make use of manipulate that more, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. AI, particularly generative AI tools and then conversational agents, are like drastically changing the way we interact with information in our information environment. And you're right to point out, may also be changing what it means to connect with an influencer online. I do want to kind of preface with the idea that to be an influencer is not just to be able to post content online. It really does involve the relationships that are formed with audiences. And so it's not just enough to be able to create an imposter version of Morgan Freeman's voice, but actually to be able to then convincingly connect that to some audience that is going to trust you because of it and form some sort of social relationship. So that kind of as the initial caveat or preface, I would say there are, I guess, 3 buckets of ways that I see AI tools starting to really change what political influencer work rather, looks like. So one is the imposter content. And so that's what you're describing, where you're trying to impersonate some already trusted individual or entity. And you're using these tools in like a deepfake kind of sense. And that, I would say, is often not going to be successful for the reasons that influencer content is successful, but might be able to dupe people, might create kind of the concerns that we've had for a long time now around mis and disinformation, definitely contributes to information disorder more broadly. So that's bucket 1. Bucket 2 is the group of folks who are saying, hey, influencers seem to have some ability to get information out, to convince people to change their minds. It's a lot of work to be an influencer. Maybe I can make the load of doing influencer work lighter if I start using these generative AI tools. And so they start creating their own content using these tools. Sometimes that's done really well and really seamlessly, and it's integrated into compelling storytelling. And other times it shows up as AI slop or things that are obviously untrue. Sometimes that's done intentionally for the lulz, just to make a joke or to be entertaining or sensational. In those cases, very often it's either very obvious it's AI tools and people don't like it, or it's integrated well into the persona that account has and it's totally fine. The third bucket, and this is the one that I think is particularly interesting, is where there are organizations, sometimes political parties, sometimes third parties, that are starting to experiment with creating AI influencers. And this is something that we've seen in influencer marketing more broadly, where entire online personalities are being fabricated through the use of these generative AI tools, from the profile image to the bio description to the content that's being posted. And they can be used potentially to tailor content and to tailor the whole entity to particular communities in particular languages with an understanding of particular cultural contexts. We saw in Germany in their last election, the ADF created, transparently to their credit, an AI influencer kind of suite of accounts to try and target different kinds of people within the German population. There has been a real lack of consistency on transparency about when this is being used and how it's being used. And even when there are labels saying, yes, this is AI generated, people don't necessarily always notice them. The platforms themselves don't have great rules yet about when and how AI use needs to be flagged. And so we're in a bit of a kind of murky territory at the moment, but it's a really interesting example of trying to meld the power of generative AI tools, which could potentially be really, really good at micro-targeting, with the power of influencers, which are typically very, very good at this kind of social pressure, social support type of influence.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, like it strikes me that, this concern about lack of consistency is one issue for people who would be subject to a regulation, but a foreign influence machinery would not be subject or would not be following those rules. So it strikes me that we end up in a challenging scenario where you have the ability to deceive at scale, and a category of people who have no intention or interest in trying to follow any requirements that might be necessary, or who could automate the generation of their submissions to appear to be genuine. It strikes me. So how do you think about the role of influencers? I know that actually the foreign influence is part of what you work on as well. So can you talk a little bit about how that shows up?
Yeah, absolutely. We know that these foreign influence campaigns are involving a lot of different techniques, and they are often doing them in ways that intentionally are evading existing laws and regulations and enforcement mechanisms. And I think we should expect that to start. If somebody wants to do nefarious activities to undermine an election, they're going to find ways to do it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try and create better transparency mechanisms for these platforms. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to make it so that people who want to use these tools in legitimate ways that are fine in terms of the strength and integrity of our democracy. We should be encouraging technological innovation and ways of engaging more folks in our system. So I think there's a balance here, and there's a real risk that sometimes comes up, especially when new technologies are first entering and they're disruptive, of, well, the bad guys are going to do it anyway. So like, what's even the point? And I think the point is, even though there are potential negative uses and problematic uses and bad guys that are going to evade rules, we still need rules to protect the common public good. How do we actually do that is, the million-dollar question. I think that there are some low-hanging fruit, some things where it's like, okay, well, quite obviously we should be able to have a way of flagging, yes, this is, like voluntarily flagging, yes, this is completely AI generated. We probably need to be able to kind of bucket what type of AI generated it is because there's a lot of variety. And then I think we need to be able to work with the tech companies to develop good tracking mechanisms for those foreign influence campaigns especially. And some of that already exists, but the introduction of generative AI into these spaces drastically shifts the scale and type of tracking and identification that needs to be done. And we also know that this is all happening at the same time that tech companies are kind of pulling back from their more self-regulatory responsibilities around minimizing online harms, which creates a tricky situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think just on that point, like it strikes me, especially there is this politicization of a lot of the work around foreign influence campaigns. Frequently, you hear that content moderation and policies are being used to suppress conservative voices. That's often a line you hear. And so, of course, if you're not paying close attention to what is actually happening, it would be I am sure that people who work on the information integrity probably tend to skew a little bit liberal on some level, but at the same time, I think that there's a good faith attempt to try to understand when you're getting this wrong from a from a bias perspective, on a content moderation side. But nevertheless, this debate gets distorted, and can make it hard to sort of even find policies that where there's consensus. And one of the things that I think that is interesting is that AI labeling is actually one of the few areas where there's very little controversy. There's wide support for that being needed. So I'm curious, like, what are you seeing in terms of places where that type of legislation is starting to come into place? And I mean, I guess also in the Canadian context, I'm very curious about who is the right authority. Do we have the right institution right now for thinking through um, how to introduce some of these policies at the moment?
There's a lot there. So let's start off with content moderation being something that like folks on the left are more likely to do that job than folks on the right. I haven't seen evidence to suggest that. I also think that when you look at the evidence around whether or not content moderation is bias in terms of partisanship, you actually don't see a really clear story that it is more suppressive of views on the right versus views on the left. Like, that's not actually what comes out of the evidence. And when you look to the civil society folks who are often the ones kind of first sounding the alarm when content moderation work is being done, there's people both on the left and both on the right that are upset about it. And I kind of think about it the same way. Like, if you ever talk to a journalist and they talk about when they're accused of partisan bias, they always say, when everyone hates me, I know I've done my job right. Like, when everyone on the left and everyone on the right thinks that something's gone wrong, like, I've probably offered a balanced view. So there's potentially something to be said for that. We know that content moderation is never going to make everybody happy. And if you are consistently making people on both extremes a little bit unhappy, maybe that's actually an indicator that things are somewhat on the right track. That said, the way trust and safety and content moderation was done a year and a half ago, 2 years ago versus today is drastically different. And there absolutely is a real issue with the way content moderation at most of the major platforms is being done right now because trust and safety teams have been pulled back. So they're under-resourced. They're trying to do a job that is often too big for them to actually do, which I would guess is going to lead to more mistakes, but we don't actually know because now there isn't the availability of data or reporting on how it's being done. So my concern with content moderation is much less partisan bias and much more, have the teams actually been equipped with the tools they need to do the job well? And content moderation is a really important job. These platforms, they control the information that we see, whether they like to think of themselves as controlling information or not. The reality is their prioritization algorithms are the thing that decide what we see and what we don't when we log onto those platforms. And so it's a crucial job.
I'm gonna take us to a related area, so it's not unrelated, but like one very easily recognizable documented case of the Cambridge Analytica Facebook Trump scandal that happened in 2016, which I'm sure we all here knowledgeable about that. But like what's interesting about it is that there's been enough years that we have so much analysis and material and evidence And anyways, we have a lot of decent understanding of like what went down there and what has been admitted that happened, etc. But this recognizable case happened pre-Gen AI era that we're living in today. And now, sure, we all here have been noticing platforms like LinkedIn, even Slack, Meta definitely have made it evident that, because they're much related with AI, that they're be using AI to actually accelerate and enhance what was possible before when it came to online profiling or audience profiling. And to me, that again, that because it's so fast paced, so new, I feel sometimes that there is an issue of literacy that people don't really understand just how much more advanced, just how much more it becomes of an issue when we have an AI, which even before AI, we were able to do machine learning and do other data techniques to do profiling. But now with AI, it's just like a new level, a more advanced level. And then added to that most of the most popular LLMs, the most powerful LLMs, like I think yesterday or the day before, ChatGPT 5.2 got released, and if you look at the benchmarks, continues to go in the progression of improvements in different scores. So what does it mean to be in this world of hyper profiling aided by AI from LLMs that are actually based in the United States? So there's an issue of sovereignty as well. And there's been an erosion of relationships between Canada and the US. But anyways, I don't know if I'm packing it very right, but like what I'm trying to say is like, from Cambridge Analytica to today, what is the elevated, advanced, heightened up level of concern that I think people need to maybe understand that maybe they're not being understood.
Yeah. So I think Cambridge Analytica pulls out at least two really important pieces of this puzzle. One is data and what happens with your personal data and who gets to use it for what purposes. And the other is the use of profiling and micro-targeting approaches. And I think both of them come into play and are exacerbated in some ways as we look at the way these different kinds of AI tools are getting used today. So when we think about Cambridge Analytica, definitely there was a huge data concern. The data that you leave as you navigate on Facebook was being used for purposes that you didn't have control over, that were against Facebook's terms, but not actually being taken down. And we know that AI tools, whether it's generative AI or advanced analytics or any kind of realm of AI tools, need a whole lot of data to be trained on. And very often our personal data ends up being the data that they are trained on. And we don't necessarily know when our data is being used or how. We don't have a chance to correct it. It all goes in, it becomes a black box. There's very little transparency. So there is absolutely still a major personal data security, data privacy concern. Then there's that kind of micro-targeting, profiling concern. And here is where there was a lot of fear of this with Cambridge Analytica. Evidence over the years has suggested that maybe there was a little bit of marketing hype in terms of how effective or how specifically targeted that was and how much it was able to manipulate people's opinions and ideas and ultimately choices when they went to vote. When we think about the way that AI tools powered by machine learning, natural language processing, these advanced analytical approaches that are AI enabled, how they're working, there's even less of an understanding of what data is being analyzed and what that means, because data gets kind of shoved into this machine and then analyses get spit out, and there isn't a lot of attention being paid to, but how is that AI model doing the analysis? What issues might be there? What biases might be built in? What errors might it be making? We don't have really good auditing systems for these tools, which means there's just a whole bunch of unknowns, which is a real risk. It is yet to be determined, I would say, how effective these kinds of advanced AI analytics are in terms of then crafting specifically tailored messages that are going to manipulate people's opinions and ideas. I would want everybody to know that while we should be wary of this, we also do need to remember that all of the information we receive is in a much wider context. So even if one political party is targeting you with a very specifically tailored advertisement, it doesn't mean that's going to necessarily change your mind, because you receive information from a bunch of different sources, and probably the conversations you have in your daily life and the other sources that you already trust are going to have an impact on how you're going to interpret those messages. So I think the kind of main short answer to your question is yes, there's some literacy issues. No, it's not easy to fix them because we just don't have enough information about how the tools are actually even being used.
Yeah, it just thought that the Treasury Board Secretariat released an AI registry, which I think probably you're aware, a couple of weeks ago. And I don't know if you've seen it, but it's basically an attempt to help people understand what are the AI use cases in the public sector. And I went through its spreadsheet, and I went through, and I even actually seen an analysis of the spreadsheet. But I actually spoke to somebody at the Treasury Board Secretariat about a little bit about the AI registry. And I pointed out how, although it's very nice that they are making things transparent in a way, it would be actually good to get a little bit more detail about the tech stack piece, because it's important to know, what models they're using, because not all models are equal. And then what are some of the data practices that they're actually using in the use cases of it, which is important also to be transparent about, because those are the elements that need oversight.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to also ask you a little bit about like what a lot of the failure to actually enact a lot of good legislation and again the sort of polarization of the conversation around how to regulate, I think is having an impact on democratic trust. And so I'm curious. There's and I think that that's a product of a number of things. But where would you start? Where do you think is the foundational place to start in terms of thinking about how to rebuild that trust?
With AI specifically or more broadly?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about okay, I guess I'm thinking about, yes, and I realize I've sort of strayed from the conversation about influencers here, but I think that I think we can probably start with digital platforms because I think, that is one area where I think the government's, there's a structural imbalance between the way these companies are designed and operate there in terms of their multidisciplinary nature, in terms of their ability to influence or at least control the conversations happening in other places. And also, I mean, there's this big monetization piece that is both resulting in trillionaires, but it's also at the same time sucking revenue streams from local independent media, which means that there's kind of an erosion of local stories, local reporting, and trusted voices. And so in this context, influencers are kind of rising at a time that you have less ability to report on local issues. And so I know that there's these issues all end up intersecting in some way, shape, or form. So recognizing that there's a much larger problem with democratic governance, where do you see the gaps on the digital governance side that could help to start to rebuild this?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a huge kind of array of things that I think need to all happen kind of in concert or at least one after another. I'll touch on a few examples. So one is you mentioned, the information environment is such that we don't have the same kind of like local level journalism being done. We don't have funding for a lot of our news media, which has traditionally played a really important role in holding government to account, holding multinational companies to account, reflecting back to the people what's happening in their community and society. That information is really, really useful. And I think that influencers are increasingly able to partially play that role, but they play that role without necessarily adhering to journalistic standards. They play that role often inconsistently. They also play that role in a way where they're offering more opinion and more kind of social context, which might seem like a risky kind of thing when you think about how you probably learned about media literacy and how to evaluate media content. But when we think about how people actually like to consume content right now and like to learn about their community and their society, that kind of opinion and that kind of social context might actually be very, very useful. So part of this is let's recognize that our news media and our accountability systems are shifting and evolving and think about, okay, where is it that we need to make sure that there is absolutely funding because we need journalistic standards to be upheld for particular kinds of information? And where is it that we can adjust our understanding and our expectations for what counts as high quality information and embrace the fact that influencers are in a potentially useful, powerful role? The other piece that I'll talk about is the idea of trust when it comes to emerging technologies. And this has been the case for social media, for other digital technologies as they've come about. Right now, generative AI and other AI tools is kind of in the spotlight. People get really scared when something new and disruptive shows up, and there is a lack of trust that kind of comes from that uncertainty. One approach that people take is to say, well, if people just get used to it, they're going to see there's no issues and it's going to be fine and it'll become part of their daily lives. So this is temporary. It's a panic. Everything's going to settle. Just give it time. Or even encourage people to use the tools, and that's going to solve the problem. The issue is, what happens is not that people get used to it and realize it's not a problem. Sometimes what happens is people get used to it and realize it's inevitable. And so the problems that they do genuinely care about, they're just going to have to accept because it feels too big and too scary to fight against. And that is my concern when we think about how AI is being integrated. So I'm going to borrow a line from Jason Miller, who's a professor at the University of Ottawa that I've worked with before. What he talks a lot about is how we need to be building trustworthiness. We need our government to be creating a regulatory system for AI development that forces these companies to think about how they can present themselves as trustworthy. And that actually is what's going to then create more trust among the public. And if the government can do that really well, they get the boon of having created this industry in a trustworthy way and get to kind of reap the rewards of being the government that figured out how to do that well.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. I think that one of the concerns that I've had in monitoring the attempts to regulate the tech sector, generally speaking, is that there's constantly this push for self-regulation. I mean, of course, right now we're watching Trump and tech companies have spent 150 million so far this year alone trying to advance a preemption law that would basically block state-level AI law. But I would put money on the fact that Trump is trying to push that on Canada via the trade agreement as well. So, it's creating a challenging landscape in which there is intense pressure to not regulate AI at a time when we need it to build trust. And then coupled with the fact that a lot of the times, even people with past regulations, such as in the EU, are kind of rolling back their timelines for implementation. They are watering down, going more towards voluntary codes of conduct. And when you end up in voluntary codes of conduct, frequently what you end up seeing is a lack of consistency in terms of the kind of data that you can access, and a bit of grading your own homework where you're cherry picking the data points that make you look good. This, to me, strikes me as not a recipe for building trust. So how does a government whose critical infrastructure depends on U.S. technology fight back against these attempts to basically not regulate something that is needed to build trust?
Yeah, absolutely. And you've really laid out the problem space quite well. We're in a really difficult position. I don't envy the government officials who have to be in those conversations trying to figure this out. One big thing that the Canadian government has going for it right now is when you look at polling from the Canadian public, the people actually really want good AI regulation. Like, this is a space where across the partisan spectrum, people are all actually quite afraid of what happens when regulation of AI industry is not done well. They want the government to do it well. They want it to be thoughtful and clear and effective. And the kind of pushback there is, right, but when those people are being pulled, they're not thinking about it in the context of trade-offs with the US and the fact that we've got this trade war, and that's true, right? That's just a difficult thing to have to deal with. But I think making use of public opinion and making use of the fact that you have the public on your side in this moment is a really, really important piece here. And we do know that there is a lot of political power Canada can wield when Canada, as the government, is acting in a way where they've got the public really on their side in a very cross-partisan way. So that is kind of what I would push for. I'll also echo your comments about self-regulation is not super effective for all the reasons you said, but also because we know that when the head of one of these tech companies changes, they can drastically, I mean, overnight, change what that self-regulation looks like. So not only is it a question about whether or not we get the kind of regulation we want, But it's also a question about whether or not we get regulation, self-regulation, that is stable enough to build a strong business case on. And if you're a smaller Canadian company who's said, okay, look, the US firms have gotten basically to establish the ground rules we're playing with, I'm going to work within those ground rules. 2 years from now, if one of those companies decides, we don't like these rules, we're changing them, all of a sudden those Canadian companies are completely under and there's no option for them. So this isn't just from an altruistic, oh, I want what's best for the Canadian public. Even if you're thinking of this through a really purely capitalist and business focused lens, ultimately it is not helpful for the Canadian AI industry to have our industry essentially self-regulated through the lens of large American companies.
And I've covered the issue of trust. Actually, I just wrote an article on that and lack of AI trust in Canada. And one of those things that I was noticing is that because of the erosion of the relationship between the US and Canada, for example, Canada signed a non-binding artificial intelligence deal with the United Arab Emirates in October. And I put a side-by-side comparison of, yes, this reality, but also like indexes like the Freedom in the World and Democratic Index list the United Arab Emirates as not free, so 18 out of 100. And so my question was like, if Canada is looking after the UAE as a country that is adopting AI in government to streamline processes, the government has backlogs, etc., in order to be as effective as the UAE or other countries whose democratic values are maybe are not as much as ours, you will have to be less democratic then if you're going to be able to do what they do, because they can do that. They can fast track many things because they're exactly doing away with civil liberties. But anyways, that was just a reflection on both of your conversation there. But my specific questions, because we're closing now, about to close on the recording. One of the things that was very exciting for me to see as I was looking after the work you do is the appearance of use cases of AI. So it for potentially a good benefit, right? And so there were some tools mentioned like the Poly tool that analyzes social media data, and then the Sambot tool. Are there any, do any of these tools stand up as something that you think is promising in terms of like turning the tide of, there are many concerns about AI, but like we can actually see opportunities to actually help us improve, if anything, helping people be more involved in civil society, etc.
Yeah, all of these different tools can be used for good and bad and all kinds of gray zones in between. Like there isn't anything I would say inherent about most of these tools that makes them something we need to fear. I think what makes them something we need to fear is the way humans choose to use them and the way humans choose to regulate them and set up boundaries around them. And so there are tools that have been shown to be fairly effective as chatbots or conversational agents to help people learn about their political system, to understand who's running in their riding, when voting day is, where to go, to be able to pick apart information in a way that is at their reading level or is culturally relevant and sensitive to their particular context. Like those could all be really helpful approaches. They're not helpful when they're done transparently. They're not helpful when they're done in a way that, the potential biases embedded in them haven't been checked. There's mis and disinformation coming out. Right now, we know that a lot of these tools do hallucinate quite a lot. They make up the truth. And that's a real problem. So the idea behind the tool and some early cases have been showing really great promise, but that doesn't get fixed unless the companies are forced to fix it, whether that's by government regulation or that's by public demand, probably by both of those together. That's when we're going to see these really helpful uses. I'll also say that there are things like translation to different languages, which is often AI supported right now. That's really helpful. That's a kind of non-questionable type of use of these kinds of tools that I think we all benefit from. The problem is if you use the tool to translate and make it seem like you speak that language fluently when you don't, that's where we get to the risks. So I think ultimately we need to be not necessarily afraid of the political uses of these kinds of tools, but we do need to be really critical of them and understand their place and in particular the role of humans in deciding what is an appropriate use of them.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Elizabeth. This has been really great. Really, really appreciate all of the interesting points you're bringing out about like the role of government, the ways that we can explore this, but the foundational obligations that are needed to get there, the need to build trust, and to just kind of bring more color to this question of who are influencers, what are they, what role are they playing in this digital ecosystem, and how can we shine lights on this so that we can and do this regulation so that we can start to overcome some of this information disorder and start to actually be able to be empowered to act on some of the excitement of these tools. So thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to continuing the conversation down the road.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Just one thing maybe before we let you go. So we'll be posting links to all, poll contact, etc. Is there anything specifically you like to actually highlight or share with the audience or with us?
Yeah, so providing a link to the Wonks and War Rooms podcast would be great. Anybody who wants to hear more of my voice, we've got a bunch of episodes. There's particularly an episode on AI and democracy. There's another episode with a roundtable on AI and democracy scholars, rather. We've got a whole season on influencers. And then I'd also say we have 2 recent reports out. So one is the multiple roles of influencers in elections report, and one is political uses of AI in Canada. I think linking both of those reports would make a lot of sense given the things we covered today.
All right. Well, we'll link all of those things. And yes, from my side as well, thank you so much for your time. And it was really great conversation. And yeah, look forward to maybe seeing you in the future. So come back.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.